Welcome to Module 1, Elements of Learning Design. I'm really excited to share this module with you. It is a really interesting place to be and to be thinking hard about what we mean by learning design. And I guess the question is, often when we're teaching, we start with curriculum. So we'll go to a curriculum, we'll look at what's in there, what are the outcomes we're looking for, what's the knowledge that we're looking to teach. And that's very important. But I would argue almost that it's not necessarily where you need to start when you're learning, when you're designing learning. When you're designing learning, you have to start with the learners themselves. So we have to understand that the learning experience is very different to the teaching experience. So we have the designed curriculum that's written by someone, maybe in the National Department of Education, or someone has written a design curriculum saying these are the intentions. Then there's what you do as a teacher to plan and to say, okay, this is the curriculum, what am I going to do with it? And then there's the actual lived experience of the learners as well. So there's the design curriculum, there's kind of the intended experience, and then there's the lived experience. And what we're trying to do through learning design is to bring the gaps between those much more narrow, so that when we're designing a learning experience, we're really thinking about what the students are going to experience. We're not just thinking about what's the most efficient way of transferring curriculum knowledge. So we're all about creating conditions and creating experiences that will allow students to develop mastery, so allow students to get even better at what you want them to get better at and what they want to get better at, and develop agency. Now, we're not going to go into agency too much now because that is the heart of Module 5, but that idea of students having some level of control over their learning. So elemental learning design is it looks a little bit complex, but it's actually quite a simple learning model. We have the hook, we have a split screen learning intention, success criteria, we have input, construction, demonstration, and reflection. And what this is, I guess, is it's a recognition of the different elements that you might want to include in a learning experience, so a designed learning experience. It isn't a plan which you have to follow slavishly. It is simply a representation of some of the different things that you might not want to miss out when you are designing learning. So we're going to go through each of these sections. We're going to start off with a hook, and then we're going to get a split screen. And then you'll notice that in our model, it becomes a little bit more cyclical. And the reason for that is it always makes sense to start with a hook and to share the learning. But once you get into input, construction, demonstration, and reflection, you can do these in a different order. You might cycle through them several times. You might have an input, then a construction, then a reflection, and then back to some more input, and then a demonstration. So there's a whole piece of, this is a fluid model, and there's a whole kind of understanding of the approach that will help you to use this more effectively. So let's have a look at the first element of learning design, the hook. So the start of the learning experience designed to engage students. Literally, I guess the metaphor is to hook them in, to get them caught on this learning, to really understand what they're going to be learning, and to get them in the right mindset for learning. So what we want to do here is to think about the possible design elements. What are the things you might do during the hook, and then some of the questions which you might be asking yourself when you're designing learning. So what we want to do with the hook, I guess, is we want to stimulate interest and curiosity. So we might use visuals, videos, or meaningful thinking routines, and I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those. We might present a purpose for learning, help students to see why. So important to motivation that students understand the why of what they're learning. Why is it important? Can we connect to the learning to real-world experiences to help students to make stronger connections with their own world and more deeply understand the content because it relates to them and their world? Can we foster positive relationships with and between students? Can we get them collaborating on the hook? Can we get them sharing information? Can we get them challenging each other? And then reapplying prior skills in a new context. So we might use the hook to reactivate something that they've learned previously. In terms of design questions around the hook, the questions I'm always asking myself are, how am I going to grab students' attention and put them in a receptive frame of mind for learning? How am I helping students to connect back to previous learning or to connect forward to learning to come? And how am I helping students to think at a higher level? So we're going to talk a little bit more in one of the modules around higher order thinking. And this is a great opportunity to get kids to think at a higher level. So a couple of quick examples for you. You might start with a thinking question on the board and ask students to discuss it in pairs. It might not even be super related to the content. It might just be about getting students kind of warmed up mentally to be critical thinkers or creative thinkers. So, for example, you can ask some slightly wacky questions like, is there more future or more past? Is mathematics a language or a science? Why do we learn? So these kind of deep questions, they're sometimes referred to as thunks. So a hard thinking it can be referred to as a thunk. You might want to bring in an artifact or an image into class and ask students what to describe what they see, explain what they think it is, and wonder about how it connects to the learning. So just bring in something that brings curiosity to the fore. Another really quick and simple idea might be have a speed date. Ask students to share what they learned last lesson with a partner, maybe 1 minute each, and then swap partners. Repeat this 2 or 3 times. So a really dynamic way of getting students to interact with each other and to reactivate prior knowledge. And then perhaps another idea is give the students the topic for the lesson and brainstorm on the board everything they already know about that topic. So a lovely way to understand where the students are at, but also a great way to activate their thinking and to activate their prior knowledge. Now, in terms of each of these elements, this might be a great opportunity for you to pause the video, which you can do at any time. Just take a little bit of a reflection and then restart the video looking at the next section, which is going to be split learning intentions. So the next part of our elemental learning design model is split screen learning intentions and success criteria. So split screen learning intentions and success criteria are all about sharing and potentially co-constructing with the students. What are they going to learn? What's the new knowledge? What are the new skills and the new tools and indeed the capabilities that they're going to develop in this next learning experience? You might have the same learning intentions over a number of lessons, or it might be a learning intention just for a specific period of time. But we're split screen in the sense that we're not just saying this is the knowledge, because that's starting with curriculum. We're not just saying this is the knowledge we're going to learn, which is important, but also these are the skills, the capabilities, and the tools that we're going to develop use of as well. And in terms of success, we're going to talk about, well, what does success look like for us? And success for different students looks different. So it's a perfect opportunity to be able to co-construct with the students their understanding of success and potentially set some goals for themselves. So for example, if I was to say, by the end of this lesson, you're going to much better deeply understand the tectonic plate theory, a student might start by thinking, well, I don't know anything about that. So success for me will be able to define some of the terms. Or a student who knows a little bit more about that, success for them might being able to evaluate or analyze the theory itself. We're going to explore those verbs, which are really useful in terms of developing a higher order thinking, which you can definitely use within your learning intentions. So the possible design elements of the split screen learning intentions are the establishment of learning goals around knowledge set, mindset, skill set, and tool set, and sharing what success looks like in the session. And the design questions you might be asking yourself right now are, well, how am I helping students to understand what they'll be learning? How can I co-construct the learning intentions and success criteria with students? And how can I help every participant understand their growth? So really important not just to tell people what they're going to learn, but to discuss and understand and help them to understand what success will look like so they can see their own learning growth. So for example, you might even set these out on the board, but you might have something which says knowledge. By the end of this lesson, we will be able to name, explain, evaluate. Again, I'm going to give you a list in the higher order thinking module of some really useful verbs that you can use to help you to write these. In terms of capability, it might be we are also going to practice our critical thinking capability when we analyze the text or evaluate the result of our experiment. You might want to also talk about the skills. So we will develop the skills of something and the skills of something else by analysis or evaluation or computation. And then we'll learn to better use the tools of spreadsheets, test tubes, thinking questions. Now, it's hard to give you good examples here because it very much depends on the context you're working in, the content you're looking at. But it's a really interesting and quite challenging but useful thing to do is to think about what are your learning intentions, how can you co-construct them with the students, and how can you help them to see growth in their learning. Again, if you want to pause and take a little break now, feel free to before we go on and look at the next section of the elemental learning model, which is input. So, input. This is the classic part of the elemental learning design model, because it's often what we think of teaching as being all about, supporting students by giving them new input. And absolutely, as a teacher, you're an expert in your domain. You can absolutely share and tell students information. Like, that's a totally valid thing to be able to do. But what we want to do as well is just be a little bit more specific about that, and also imaginative and creative around different ways of inputting information. So providing the design elements of input are providing clear explanations, definitions, or rules, and how it connects to related concepts or skills. Provide examples and non-examples to help students to better understand. Use students' previous experiences as a basis for explaining concepts. Information presented visually and or concrete examples, and this is called dual coding, which we're going to look at in the next module. And then the concept or skill represented in multiple ways, and your inner thought processes revealed to the students through modeling. So if you are going to be presenting something, don't just tell them about it, but actually model it out loud. Go through what and explain what you're thinking as if they could hear the inner voice. In terms of design questions, you might be thinking about, well, what resources and materials can I provide to the students? How will I make sure that students understand how the concept or skill they're learning connects to other concepts and skills? And how will I ensure every participant understands? How can I help each participant to advance at their pace? So some really challenging design questions there. Bearing in mind that when we talk about learning, we're constantly talking about building connections. That's what really learning fundamentally is. It's about building schema in your brain. And so we want to really be, when we're inputting new information, really clear about how it connects to other information as well. So a couple of simple examples. You might jigsaw. So you might divide the class into groups, give each group a different resource, maybe a text or a graph or a diagram or whatever, and ask them to study it and be ready to teach it to another group. So input doesn't always have to come from you directly. So they can then pair up with another group and teach each other what they've learned, and you can then test for misconceptions. Visible modeling. So making whatever you are modeling, whether it's a text, an equation, a process, etc., really visible. If you're using the chalkboard, ask the students to move closer to the front so they can interact with your model by asking questions. And all that thing we mentioned just now was this idea of thinking out loud. As you're modeling on the chalkboard or you're modeling your thinking, make sure you're drawing or writing out and speaking out loud as if your inner voice were made audible. Are an incredibly effective method for supporting students in seeing your thinking and the connections that you're making. So take a little bit of time, maybe pause the video, have a think about your input. What are the different ways that you input information to students before we move on to the construct or the constructions part of the elemental learning design model. Construction. So elemental learning design model, we've had the hook, we've had the split screen learning intentions, we've talked about how we might input material. Now it's time to consider, what are we going to do to help the students to construct their understanding? So how are we going to help them to take the new information and then build it into schema in their brains? So guided practice and independent learning is a really important part of this, and sometimes we make that homework, but actually I would like to challenge that and get you to think about why it's important to do some of that in class, to create that time and space in class for students to do this, so that you can interact with them immediately, so that they can ask questions of you and each other immediately. So some immediacy around that construction, not waiting, I'm just going to tell you things for an hour and then you're going to go home and try and figure it out yourself. So building tasks and activities or exercises which have got well scaffolded opportunities for students to apply the knowledge or skills, so get them to use it. Clear instructions with time frame and clear expectations, so we know what we're going to do, how long it's going to take, and what success is going to look like. This is the opportunity for you to interact with students to determine the level of mastery and provide feedback and individual support as needed. If we spend all of our time on an input mode, so we're just sharing information, that means that we're not creating time for us to be one-on-one with students in class and to provide some of that feedback and individual support. It's also a great opportunity to undertake more open-ended, independent construction tasks as mastery emerges. So the better students get at something, the more time you might want to give them to work in this space. And also gives you lots of opportunities to use formative assessment to identify growth. And we've got a whole module on assessment of and for learning, coming up with some more strategies around that. In terms of a design question that I'm asking as a teacher or a facilitator, is I'm thinking, well, how am I going to support all students in terms of levels of achievement? So how am I going to make sure that even though students have different levels of achievement, I'm going to help them all get to the same place? How am I going to differentiate tasks? How will I effectively integrate technology use into this phase if I'm going to use technology? And how are students accessing feedback and feed forward? So again, constantly as a learning designer, I'm asking questions about my practice. A couple of examples here about construction activities. It might be, for example, that students take the new information and work as a team to create a concept map showing key elements and connections. Or you might give students some practice questions. They swap with a partner and give feedback to each other. Or something as simple as a 5 whys. So students complete a 5 whys analysis to understand the reasoning behind the new information. And there's a lovely example of that in the worked models section of your workbook. Okay, so again, if you want to pause the video and have a little think about construction, now's the time. Maybe explore your workbook, even take some notes, i.e. take a little bit of time for you to construct your understanding. Okay, we're now in the demonstration part of the elemental learning design model. And this is really important. Sometimes there's a misconception between demonstration and reflection. I just want to make it really clear that demonstration is about showing what you know in terms of new learning. Reflection is about showing what you know or thinking about what you've done in terms of yourself as a learner. We often call that metacognition, so thinking about your own learning, your own thinking. So for this stage, we're looking at demonstration, which is really focused in on demonstrating knowledge set and skill set that they've developed during this learning experience. Could be as simple as the form of a Q&A session, an exit ticket where they have to jot things down just as they're leaving. You can then look at that and then give some feedback. Might be a presentation, might be a piece of writing. We know that we can't actually see learning happening in students' brains, so we design proxies. And a proxy for learning is anything that helps you to see that students have learned. It could be an essay, it could be a video they make, it could be, I'm going to look at some examples in a second, but whatever proxy you design, whatever you say to the students, right, this is how you're going to show your knowledge, it should allow them to demonstrate at the level of mastery. So they're able to share with you and others what they know and the skills that they've developed. So some of your questions around your design might be, well, what proxy am I going to design to allow students to demonstrate their discipline-specific growth? How will I use the feedback I gather from this demonstration of learning to inform my practice and any learning interventions I need to put in place? So some useful design questions there for you. And finally, just a couple of examples here. For example, if in terms of demonstration, the students could create a teaching resource on the new material, they might make a quiz or a game or a task themselves, because obviously one of the things we know is if you have to teach something, then you need to really deeply understand it. Students could create a video demonstrating their new understanding. They could create an infographic using words, data, and images that communicates their understanding to a non-expert. Or they might complete a group quiz so that they can share their answers to help fill in any gaps in knowledge. So while I do want to know where students are at in their understanding, I also want to make sure I'm filling in gaps. So I don't want to leave anyone behind. So this is why demonstration is such an important part of the elemental learning design model. Take a moment, have a think, maybe pause the video, or you can come straight with me into the next piece, which is going to be looking at reflection. Okay, the final part of our elemental learning design model. I say final, but bearing in mind that we might be cycling through this little cycle here many times within a learning design experience, or we might, be jotting across and reflecting first before we even have any new input. So this is a very flexible and fluid process that you can change around to meet the needs that you have. So in terms of reflection, what we want is students to think about their growth as learners, including the capabilities. Remember that we've got our final module, module 6 is all about the capabilities. And so some of the possible design elements of a reflection moment might be, we make some explicit connections between the learning experience and metacognition. So we're really talking about, well, this is what we did, how well did you do it as a learner? We're going to definitely reflect less on what you've learned, but rather on how you have learned. And we're going to identify and replicate capabilities and positive learning behaviors. This is really that moment to say, oh, well, what brilliant collaboration you just demonstrated there. Let's make sure we highlight that so that you can then use it again and demonstrate that positive learning behavior again in a future learning experience. So in terms of design questions, you might be asking things like, how am I going to help students reflect on their learning? Which thinking routines could I use? So we've already seen 3, 2, 1 bridge, and we've got a bunch of other thinking routines coming up soon to help you to do that. And then how am I going to support students in understanding their own growth in terms of capabilities and positive learning behaviors? So having those explicit conversations about positive learning behaviors, reflecting on yourself as a learner, is absolutely key and really a really powerful way to help students to understand themselves better as learners. A couple of examples, you might use a thinking routine. A really easy peasy thinking routine is WWWEBI, what went well, even better if, to talk about how they learned in the lesson. So what went well for you in the lesson? Not what did you learn, but what went well? How did you work effectively? Did you take really good notes? Were you a critical thinker? Did you come up with some creative ideas? Or even better if, what could you do better next time? So getting students to think about that and set some goals. Students could use a growth ladder, which is, you'll learn all about that in Module 6, to reflect on how they are developing in terms of one of the capabilities that you focused on in the split screen learning intention. So for example, if you focused on critical thinking, they could use that growth ladder to analyze and see where they are at with their critical thinking. Finally, you might get students to set a goal for themselves around how they might be even more successful next lesson. We call this self-regulation. Okay, you can take a little break if you want, pause the video and think and reflect on reflection and maybe how you've been learning throughout this module so far. Okay, in your workbook, you will find a quick design canvas, and this is the challenge for this module. What I'd love you to do is to actually just plan a learning experience. It might be a single lesson, might be a couple of lessons, but I want you to use what you've learned so far in this module to plan this. And this is the quick design canvas is a space where you can do that. It's really straightforward. You don't have to use this. You could just do it on paper if you wanted to, or on a computer, but you can use your workbook to help you. But basically all it's saying is, okay, what's the hook? How am I going to get my learners hooked into the learning to think about their previous learning or to connect into what's coming next? I might jot down the learning intentions around knowledge, capability, skill set, and tool set. So I'm thinking about, well, what's that going to look like? What are they going to know? What capability are we going to focus on? What skills are they going to develop? What tools might they use? And then I've got 6 learning activities here. You might not use all 6. That's absolutely fine. But what I've done is I've just said learning activity 1. It could be input. It could be construct. It could be demo. It could be reflect. It's up to you. Like I said, this is a flexible model. But what you might do is that if this was input, for example, you might circle input and then start to take some notes in here about, okay, well, how am I going to share new information? Learning activity 2 could be construct. So you might circle that and say, this is what I'm going to get the students to do to build their understanding. It might then actually have some more input, for example. So you might actually, your learning activity 3, you might go back, do a little bit more input, and then even again, a little bit more construct. You then might be going, okay, well, this is how I'm going to get the students to demonstrate their learning. So demo, you might circle that, make some notes on here. And then the final thing is you might get them to reflect. Again, these are very interchangeable. You can use this in any way you want. You might have more than 6 learning activities. You might have less than 6 learning activities, entirely up to you. And this is just a little bit of space for you to jot down any thoughts around resources or notes that you need to think of. So what I would love to do, and my challenge to you for this module, is to create a learning design plan using this quick design canvas and share it. Either you can share it into Google Classroom if you're on the Google Classroom for this project, or you can share it with your colleague and get some feedback and start those conversations with them all about learning design. And finally, your reflection for this module is a connect extend question. Now, as I said before, when you see this little toolkit, this means this is a reflection activity or a tool you can use with your students. So connect extend question is just getting you to think, okay, what connected with your current understanding of learning design in this module? So what you've learned so far in the module, what made sense to you? What were you already doing? Yeah, got it, totally. What extended, if anything, your current understanding? What new ideas did you come away with? So just jot them down in your learning journal, in your workbook, because it's a really useful thing to see how you have grown through a module. And finally, maybe what questions do you still have? And if you still have some really challenging questions, share them with either in Google Classroom or with your colleagues, and try and better understand any misconceptions you've got or any questions that you still have there. Don't forget, there are a bunch of these thinking routines. They're on the website pz.harvard.edu. You can also develop your own, and I'm going to give you a bunch of them throughout the module. Well done on completing Module 1. I hope it was of great use to you, and looking forward to Module 2 coming up very, very soon.